In this video, I'm going to be talking about alkaloids. Alkaloids are substances that meet three particular criteria. Number one, it is an amine. An amine is a molecule that has a nitrogen atom with 3 bonds to either hydrogens or carbon atoms, some variety of hydrogens and carbons. Number two, the amine is naturally occurring. That means that it is produced in a biological system, could be a plant, could be an animal, or if it's not naturally occurring, it is a derivative of a naturally occurring molecule. So it's synthetic, but its structure is based off of something that exists in nature. And then the third criteria is that it causes a physiological response in humans, meaning that when we ingest it, it causes our body to respond one way or another. So I'm going to begin by talking about two specific amines. The first one are alkaloids. The first one I'm going to talk about is caffeine. Now, caffeine is an alkaloid because number one, it is an amine. It's got nitrogens all over. Number two, it is produced in coffee plants, tea plants, and cocoa beans. So it meets the criteria of being a naturally occurring substance. And then number three, in terms of a physiological response, it is a mild stimulant. Most people have taken caffeine, ingested caffeine, so you understand the mildness of the stimulant. Caffeine is an addictive substance, but it's very easy to withdraw from that addiction. When you consume caffeine, it enters your bloodstream through your small intestine, and it is both water soluble and fat soluble. So that means that it moves from your bloodstream into your brain. Your blood is a water-based environment, your brain is a fat-based environment, and it's in your brain where the caffeine molecule actually does its work. Caffeine is structurally similar to a molecule called adenosine. So here's the structure of adenosine, and here's the caffeine molecule, and you can see that this portion of the adenosine molecule is pretty similar to the structure of caffeine. So once you get caffeine into your brain, the caffeine molecule fits itself into the brain's receptors for the adenosine molecule, and it blocks the absorption of adenosine. Let me talk a little bit about what that's referring to. So inside our brain, we have these molecules that are called receptors. You can kind of think of them like parking spots. There are places where, for example, the adenosine molecule fits and where the adenosine molecule belongs. So in these little parking spots, in these receptors, the adenosine molecule just fits itself right into that receptor. It kind of creates almost like a bond. It just kind of locks itself into place into this receptor. The absorption of the adenosine molecules into those receptors, so when the adenosine molecule fits itself into those receptors, it causes tiredness. Now, because caffeine mimics the structure of the adenosine molecule, the caffeine can sit in the adenosine receptor as well. So the caffeine can park itself into these adenosine receptors. Putting caffeine into an adenosine receptor does not do anything at all in terms of, what that receptor should be doing. It's just basically blocking this parking spot so that the adenosine molecules can't get in. And since your adenosine molecules cannot get into their receptors, this means that you don't get the tiredness feeling that you should be getting if the adenosine was being properly absorbed. In addition to that, having an accumulation of adenosine in your brain causes your brain to realize that something is wrong, which initiates the production of adrenaline. So again, we have all these receptors in our brain, and our body is producing all of these adenosine molecules that are supposed to make their way into these receptors so that we can begin to feel tired. But instead of the adenosine molecules getting in there, the caffeine molecules get in there instead. The caffeine molecules in the receptors don't do anything at all other than blocking the adenosine, so we don't feel tired. Plus, in addition, all that buildup of adenosine makes us get a little bit of an adrenaline rush. And this is how caffeine works. In terms of caffeine addiction, when you use caffeine quite a bit, so you have these adenosine receptors, you have these adenosine molecules that are waiting to get into the receptors, you've got the caffeine molecules coming in, blocking the space, and your brain says, I'm getting tired of this, having all this buildup of extra adenosine. So your brain responds by building extra receptors to give places for your adenosine molecules to go. And this is what we define as addiction to caffeine, when your brain brain restructures itself in response to your caffeine consumption. Your brain grows more adenosine receptors to accommodate this interference from caffeine. You can easily reverse this process. If you go a couple of weeks without consuming any caffeine at all, the brain realizes that all those extra receptors are unnecessary and it gets rid of them, gets you back to a normal amount of adenosine receptors and returns to normal function. So even though caffeine is addictive, it's very easy and very quick to get over caffeine addiction. The next molecule that we're going to talk about is nicotine. Nicotine also meets the criteria of being an alkaloid. It is an amine. It is produced in the tobacco plant, and it is a stimulant. It could be a depressant depending on how much you consume. So it does cause a physiological response. Nicotine is also addictive, and many people who are addicted to nicotine claim that it is the most addictive, most difficult addiction to break. Just like caffeine, nicotine starts by going into our bloodstream and then it moves from our bloodstream into our brain because it also is water soluble and fat soluble. And it acts in the brain in a way that's pretty similar to caffeine. Nicotine mimics the structure of a molecule called acetylcholine. So again, here is our nicotine molecule and here is the acetylcholine molecule. And these portions in red, the portions in red of these two molecules, they are pretty similar. So same kind of general idea. Nicotine fits itself into the acetylcholine receptors in our brain. So we've got these receptors, again, these parking spots that are designed for acetylcholine, but now instead of filling with acetylcholine, they fill with the nicotine molecule. And so that much of it is the same as caffeine. However, this part is different. When nicotine fits itself into the acetylcholine receptor, it actually triggers the same sort of response as the absorption of acetylcholine. So when caffeine fits into those receptors, the body just doesn't do anything, doesn't acknowledge the caffeine. But when nicotine fits into the receptor, basically the brain can't differentiate between whether it's nicotine or whether it's acetylcholine sitting in those receptors. So when your body absorbs acetylcholine or nicotine, either one, this triggers respiration, heart rate, memory, muscle movement, all different kinds of things. So putting nicotine into your brain, mimicking the behavior of acetylcholine, kind of in a way makes nicotine like an essential component of your body's functioning. This is one of the reasons why it is so extremely addictive. Prolonged use of nicotine causes your brain to think there is an excess of acetylcholine. So again, the way this works is we've got all these receptors. Your body is producing all of this acetylcholine. You're ingesting all of this nicotine. Your brain can't really differentiate between nicotine and acetylcholine. So some of these molecules are getting into the receptors. Some of them are not. Your body sees all of these extra nicotine, acetylcholine molecules, and your body responds in two different ways. One way that it responds is by eliminating some of the natural production of acetylcholine. And when that happens, your brain starts to become chemically dependent on nicotine. If your body is not producing the acetylcholine, you rely on nicotine to trigger those receptors. Withdrawal from nicotine and the brain rebuilding process is way slower than that of caffeine. So it can take about a year for your body to return to normal once you start not consuming nicotine anymore. We are now going to talk about three different general classes of alkaloids, so not a particular molecule in itself. The next thing we're going to talk about is a local anesthetic alkaloid. An anesthetic is a molecule or a substance that reduces sensitivity to pain or causes numbness. If it is local, that means it only acts on a particular area, usually the area where it is applied or where it is injected. And then again, as you know, the alkaloid means that it's an amine that comes from a natural product that causes some sort of physiological response. Local anesthetic alkaloids are lidocaine, cocaine, and novocaine, which is also known as procaine. Notice that all of these molecules have the same suffix, the same ending. They all end in the cane sound. So all the molecules that have that same ending all belong to this same class, the local anesthetics. These molecules all work by preventing sodium ions from moving through the nerve cells, which blocks the pain pathway, which just makes it so you don't feel pain. Cocaine also causes a buildup of dopamine, so this is why it is an addictive substance. The dopamine buildup is what causes it to be a drug that gets abused. Opiate alkaloids are alkaloids that are derived from the poppy plant. Some of these are molecules that are actually derived from the poppy plant, and some of them are synthesized. So like OxyContin, oxycodone, this is a molecule that does not exist naturally, but you can see that its structure is very similar to the structure of a natural product. These are also very addictive. They bind to the opioid receptors in our nerve cells, so our body's created with receptors for these particular molecules. When we have opiates that are binding to receptors on our nerve cells, this prevents nerves from transmitting any kind of information, including pain signals. All of our opiates have the same general structure of 5 rings fused together. You can see they all have a similar shape. And these are molecules that mimic the action of endorphins, which are hormones that minimize the perception of pain, and they also increase the euphoric sensation. And last but not least, I'm going to talk about benzodiazepine barbiturates. These are all molecules that have an ending in am, diazepam, lorazepam, alprazolam, clonazepam. Benzodiazepines are tranquilizer molecules. Barbiturates are sedatives. So together, these are things that just really calm you down. Heterocyclic, that's a fancy word that just means in the ring. So in this particular ring, there are at least 2 different types of atoms. So carbon atoms with nitrogen atoms together, that's what is meant by a heterocycle. These can be addictive substances. They work by enhancing the action of GABA, which is a substance that's naturally present in our brain that inhibits our nervous activity, means that it makes you less nervous, and it also enhances sedation or sedative properties.